The sun was setting behind the smoldering horizon, casting an eerie glow over the ruins of Aurelia, the last stronghold of the human resistance against the overwhelming Sharon Empire captain. Marcus Leary crouched behind a crumbling wall, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in short gasps. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and blood. The distant sounds of combat echoed through the shattered landscape. His unit had been given the order to retreat, but the evacuation had been chaotic, and the enemy forces were closing in on them. Marcus's eyes scanned the battlefield through the smoke and debris. He could see flashes of movement, the silhouettes of Sharon soldiers, advancing relentlessly. The evacuation had been a failure, a disaster. He knew it was only a matter of time before the human forces were completely overwhelmed. As he crouched in the rubble, Marcus's mind raced through the options. His orders had been clear: pull back, regroup at the rally point. But the rally point was miles away. The Sharons controlled the skies, and ground troops were sweeping through the area with brutal efficiency. Marcus looked around at the devastation. The once vibrant city of Aurelia now lay in ruins, its buildings reduced to skeletal remains and smoldering husks. The civilians who had once called it home were either dead or scattered, fleeing in fear. There was no time to waste. Marcus gritted his teeth and rose to his feet. He had to move quickly and find a way out, but something stopped him, a faint sound, a cry that cut through the din of the battle. He turned his head toward the source of the noise, his eyes narrowing, as he spotted a small figure half hidden beneath a pile of debris. It was a child. The child was small, frail, with greenish-gray skin, and the distinct features of a Sharon, the alien race that had been waging war against humanity for years. Marcus's instincts screamed at him to move away, to avoid getting involved in the struggle, but something held him in place. The child was no more than 6 or 7 years old, its body bruised and bloodied. It struggled to free itself from the rubble, its eyes wide with terror. Marcus's heart ached. He had seen the horrors of war firsthand, but nothing had prepared him for this, an innocent life caught in the crossfire of a conflict that seemed endless. Without thinking, Marcus bolted toward the child, ignoring the sound of gunfire and explosions that rang out in the distance. He reached the child within moments, his hands trembling as he carefully lifted the debris off its tiny body. The child whimpered in pain, its eyes locked onto Marcus's with a mix of fear and desperation. Marcus forced a reassuring smile, even though he could feel his own fear rising inside him. He had no plan, no backup, and the enemy was closing in. But in that moment, all he could think about was getting the child to safety. He scooped the child up into his arms, ignoring the weight of his armor and the exhaustion that weighed him down. The child was light, fragile in his grip, its tiny fingers clutched at his shirt, as if holding on to the only lifeline it had left. Marcus's mind raced as he searched for a way out. The battlefield was chaos. Sharon soldiers were advancing in every direction, but he couldn't leave the child behind. He couldn't let it die here, not like this. As he sprinted through the crumbling city streets, Marcus's thoughts were a blur of fear and determination. Every step felt like a gamble with death. He didn't know if he could make it back to the evacuation point, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't abandon the child to the flames of war. No matter what it took, he had to get it out of here. He had to save it. Marcus stumbled over debris as he sprinted through the shattered streets, the weight of the child in his arms growing heavier with every step. His mind raced with the sound of distant explosions and the crackling of gunfire all around him. He knew the enemy forces were closing in, and he was running out of time. The evacuation ships were far ahead on the other side of the city, but getting there was like running into the heart of a storm. Every corner he turned was met with danger. Every alley was a potential death trap. The child's small body trembled against him, and he could feel its heartbeat quicken with every noise that rattled through the air. He tried to comfort it, whispering reassurances, though he didn't even believe them himself. They both had only one chance to make it out alive, and he was going to make sure they took it. As he moved forward, Marcus's training kicked in, his instincts sharpened in the heat of the moment. His eyes darted from side to side, assessing the landscape, calculating the risks. He noticed a narrow alley ahead, one that seemed less traveled, a possible route to safety. He veered in that direction, desperate for any kind of cover or escape route. But the moment he rounded the corner, his heart skipped a beat. The unmistakable sound of Sharon's soldiers shouting in the distance froze him in place. They were already patrolling the area, their voices growing louder. Marcus's pulse raced. He couldn't outrun them, not with the child in his arms. It was too risky. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. He ducked behind a half-collapsed building, pulling the child into the shadows with him, both of them now hidden from view. He held his breath as the Sharon soldiers passed by, unaware of his presence, their heavy footsteps thudding against the ground, their language harsh and guttural as they searched for any remaining survivors. Marcus's eyes never left the soldiers. He could feel his heart pounding in his throat and could hear the child's rapid breathing, matching his own. In time, he clenched his jaw and made the decision to move again. He couldn't stay here for long. The Sharons would eventually sweep this area. Once the soldiers were out of earshot, Marcus made a quick but calculated dash through the crumbling ruins toward a nearby building with a broken doorframe. He needed a place to regroup, just for a moment, to catch his breath and think through the next steps. But as they neared the entrance, an explosion shook the ground, sending a shockwave through the building, knocking Marcus off his feet. He hit the ground hard, but managed to keep a firm grip on the child. His ears rang as dust and debris settled around them, the world spinning. For a moment, he could barely hear anything over the ringing in his skull. But as the haze cleared, he realized something even worse than the explosion was happening outside. More Sharon forces had arrived, and they were closing in fast. Panic surged through Marcus's chest. His eyes frantically searched for a way out, but there was none in sight. The building offered no real cover, and every direction he looked led to more danger. But there was a faint sound rising through the chaos, something that barely reached his ears, but it was enough to give him a glimmer of hope. The sound of an evacuation ship overhead through the haze. He caught a glimpse of its silhouette cutting through the sky. It was their last chance, their only chance to escape the city. Marcus grit his teeth, and with one last burst of strength, he picked up the child again and ran toward the open street, hoping against hope that they could make it in time before the Sharons found them. Marcus's legs burned with exhaustion as he sprinted down the narrow street. The child's weight was a constant pressure against his chest, but he couldn't stop. Not now. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the air, but he focused only on the ship in the sky, its engines roaring like a distant promise of safety. Each step felt heavier than the last, but the sight of that ship propelled him forward. It was their only chance. The city was falling apart around them, the buildings crumbling with the force of the battle raging just beyond the ruins. But he didn't have time to think about that. He didn't have time to think about anything except getting to the ship. The wind howled as it swept through the wreckage, and the air felt thick with the dust and smoke of the destruction. Marcus's lungs burned with every breath, but he kept running, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the evacuation ship circled above the planet's dying surface. The Sharons were everywhere now, their soldiers moving in groups through the streets, hunting down any survivors. They had eyes on the skies, their ships patrolling above the city. He knew they had to be close to the ship before it left. If he missed this chance, he and the child would be left behind to face whatever horrors the enemy had planned for them. A sudden sound snapped him out of his thoughts, the unmistakable noise of boots crunching on broken concrete. Marcus's head whipped around just in time to see a squad of Sharon soldiers emerging from an alley, their eyes scanning the area. They hadn't seen him yet, but it wouldn't be long before they did. Marcus's pulse quickened, his instincts screamed at him to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The street was wide open, the soldiers were closing in, and the evacuation ship was still too far away. In a split second, Marcus made a decision. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. He crouched low and darted toward a collapsed building, hoping to use it for cover. He could hear the Sharon soldiers' footsteps growing louder behind him, but he didn't look back. The child in his arms clutched him tighter, its small fingers gripping the fabric of his uniform, as if sensing the danger that was approaching. But Marcus couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop, not now. He reached the building and slid behind a pile of rubble, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he crouched down, pulling the child close to him. They had to remain hidden, No matter the cost, if they were caught, it would be over for both of them. Marcus's eyes scanned the area through the cracks in the rubble, and he saw the Sharons draw nearer, their weapons ready, their movements methodical as they searched for any sign of human presence. Marcus's heart thudded in his chest. He couldn't let them find him, not now, not when they were so close to escaping. The soldiers moved past him, just a few feet away, their eyes scanning the debris, but luckily they didn't spot him. The seconds stretched into an eternity, but Marcus remained perfectly still, holding his breath, his pulse racing, but his body frozen in place. Then, as if in slow motion, one of the soldiers paused, his gaze shifting toward the shadow where Marcus hid, his breath caught in his throat. But just as the soldier took a step forward, a loud explosion ripped through the air. A nearby building collapsed with a deafening roar, throwing up a cloud of dust and debris. The Sharon soldiers were distracted for a moment, their attention diverted away from Marcus and the child. Seizing the opportunity, Marcus surged to his feet and bolted forward. The Sharon soldiers yelled in confusion, but he didn't dare look back. He just ran as fast as he could, his legs pumping, his breath ragged in his chest. The ship was still in the sky. Just ahead, he could see the faint outline of the escape pod descending, but he was still too far away. And the soldiers were starting to regroup. The sound of their weapons charging sent a jolt of fear through him, but he refused to stop. He couldn't afford to stop, not when the child was counting on him. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted down the street. Every muscle in his body screamed with the effort, but there was no time to slow down, no time to think. The evacuation ship was coming closer, but still too far away. The Sharon soldiers were regrouping, and he could hear their heavy footsteps echoing off the shattered buildings behind him. Each step was a countdown to disaster. He couldn't outrun them, not with the child in his arms, but he refused to let that thought take root. He had to make it. He had to survive, no matter the cost. The wind whipped through the city, dragging the smell of smoke and burning metal with it. Marcus's eyes watered from the sting, but he didn't blink. He couldn't afford to let his guard down even for a second. As he neared an intersection, he took a sharp turn and ducked into a narrow alleyway, hoping to lose the soldiers in the maze of ruined buildings. But the moment he entered the alley, he realized his mistake. The alley was a dead end. The only way forward was the same route he'd just taken, the way the Sharons were now closing in on from behind. He had no choice but to turn and face them, his chest heaving with the effort of running. But he kept his grip tight on the child, praying that they wouldn't be spotted until it was too late. In the dim light of the alley, he could see the soldiers approaching, their shadows growing larger and larger with each passing second. The child stirred in his arms, its small voice breaking through the silence. As it whimpered, Marcus shushed it softly, trying to keep it calm. But he could feel the fear radiating from the tiny body, his own fear mirrored in every fiber of his being. He had to act fast. He couldn't let the soldiers see them. There was no way he could fight them all off, and even if he could, there were too many. The Sharon forces would overwhelm him eventually. The sound of the soldiers' voices grew louder, and he knew they were almost on top of him. In that moment, Marcus's mind raced through every possible option, and he made a split-second decision. There was only one chance. He had left, one way to get out of this alive. He glanced up at the sky. The ship was still there, hovering in place. It was too far for him to reach on foot, but maybe there was another way. Without warning, Marcus turned and bolted back down the alleyway, his feet pounding against the broken pavement. His only focus now was getting out of the alley and finding a way to get the child to safety. He could hear the soldiers yelling behind him and the sound of their weapons charging, but he didn't dare look back. He just ran faster, ignoring the pain in his legs, the scream of his muscles, begging him to stop. His eyes locked on the narrow gap at the end of the alley, a small opening between two buildings. If he could reach it, he might have a shot at getting to the next street and getting closer to the ship. As he neared the gap, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the unmistakable whine of an energy weapon charging up behind him. Without thinking, he dove to the side, his body hitting the ground hard as a blast of energy streaked past him, narrowly missing the edge of his armor. He scrambled to his feet and kept running, the soldiers' voices now a deafening roar as they closed in on him. But just as he reached the gap in the alley, a shadow crossed his path, and a figure stepped out in front of him. For a moment, Marcus's mind went blank as he tried to process the sudden appearance of the figure. But then his body reacted before his brain could catch up. He slammed into the figure, throwing them both to the ground, his hands instinctively protecting the child as they rolled across the ground. He was on top of the stranger in an instant, his heart still racing. But there was no time to question who the figure was or what they wanted. All he knew was that he had to survive. Marcus's body crashed into the figure with a force that sent them both sprawling to the ground, the child still in his arms, pressing against him as they tumbled over the cracked pavement. For a moment, everything was a blur of motion, pain, and confusion. His mind raced, trying to assess the situation as quickly as possible, but his instincts kept him moving without thinking. He pushed himself up, his hands shaking with adrenaline, his breath ragged as he rolled to his feet, keeping the child close to his chest. The stranger beneath him groaned and struggled to push themselves up as well. Marcus's eyes locked onto the figure. The moment they made eye contact, his heart skipped a beat. It was a Sharon soldier, not just any soldier, but one wearing the insignia of a high-ranking officer. The figure was taller than most, with piercing blue eyes and angular features. Their armor was marked with symbols of authority and rank, and their posture suggested someone who was used to command, not a mere foot soldier. Marcus's instincts screamed at him to move, to attack, but his mind told him to stop. There was something different about this Sharon. This wasn't like any enemy he had fought before. For a moment, neither of them moved, just stared at each other in tense silence. The world around them seemed to disappear. The only thing that mattered was the heavy breath of the stranger and the faint sound of the evacuation ship hovering above in the distance. The child's small body shifted in Marcus's arms, as if sensing the danger, but it was silent, its wide eyes staring up at the Sharon officer. Then the officer spoke, their voice calm and surprisingly soft. In the midst of the chaos, "You saved her, didn't you?" Marcus's mind raced, the words taking a moment to process before they settled into his consciousness. The officer was referring to the child, the one he had risked everything to save, and the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This was the mother. She was the one who had given birth to this child, the one he had saved in the ruins of the city, the very one who had probably been fighting against his people only moments earlier, now stood before him, a face filled with an expression he couldn't quite understand, a mixture of disbelief and something else he couldn't name. For the first time since their confrontation on Aurelia, Marcus felt his hands tremble, not from fear, but from the weight of the unexpected. "You saved my daughter," she repeated, her voice low, but filled with an odd intensity. She rose slowly to her feet, still watching him with those piercing eyes. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. And in that statement, Marcus heard a world of meaning. What did she mean by this? Why wasn't she attacking him? Why hadn't she killed him on the spot? Why hadn't she taken revenge for the death of so many of her soldiers and people? Marcus swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. He didn't have a clear answer. There was no time for words anyway. But he couldn't bring himself to run again. Not now, not with the officer standing there staring at him with a look that was too complicated for him to understand. "You could have let her die. You could have left her behind like so many others," he said, his voice rough and hoarse. But there was no malice, no anger, only exhaustion. "She could have been killed, but I couldn't do that." The officer's eyes softened just a fraction, and she tilted her head slightly as if considering his words. "I know you couldn't," she said, and then with surprising gentleness she continued, "And I won't forget that, but it isn't enough to stop me from doing what must be done." Marcus's chest tightened, and for a moment he forgot about the soldiers approaching from the other side of the alley. He forgot about the chaos outside. He only saw the Sharon officer standing in front of him, with a strange mixture of grief and resolve in her eyes. Marcus's heart raced, his mind struggling to process what the officer had just said, but her words were a blur, his focus shifting to the sound of distant footsteps growing louder. The Sharon soldiers were closing in. He could hear their movements echoing off the shattered buildings, the crunch of boots against debris. Marcus's instincts kicked and every muscle in his body screamed for action. But he couldn't move, he couldn't just leave, not now, not with this officer standing in front of him, blocking his way. The officer's gaze shifted to the approaching soldiers, her posture stiffening, as if preparing for something. Marcus wasn't sure what was happening, or what this officer intended, but he knew one thing for certain: if he didn't act quickly, they were both going to be caught in the open, exposed. With no way out, the child in his arms shifted again, pressing tighter against his chest, its small form trembling against him. "You should run," she said, without turning to face him, her voice steady and firm, her eyes never leaving the path where the soldiers were advancing. "They'll see you if you stay here, and they'll take her away." Marcus's throat tightened as he glanced at the officer, wondering why she wasn't more concerned about her own safety, why she was willing to sacrifice herself for him and the child. But she wasn't finished speaking. She kept her voice low, but filled with an urgency. "You don't have much time to get to the ship. You need to go now." Marcus hesitated, his mind racing. He couldn't leave her behind. He couldn't abandon someone who had just spared his life, someone who had spoken of saving her daughter. And yet he knew she was right. They had no more time to waste. The soldiers would be upon them any second, and he couldn't afford to be caught again. The officer turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto his. She understood the hesitation in his gaze, the moral dilemma twisting in his gut, and with a resigned sigh she made her decision. She didn't need to speak the words, they were already understood. "Go," she said again, her tone now more insistent. "Don't worry about me, just go." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, his mind racing over everything that had happened in the past few hours, everything that had led to this moment. The war, the battle, the child in his arms, the officer in front of him. None of it made sense. But the one thing he could understand was the reality of their situation. He could see the soldiers approaching faster now, their weapons raised, their eyes scanning every corner, looking for the threat. And Marcus knew if he didn't leave now, there would be no escaping them. With one last look at the officer, his gaze softened for just a second before he turned and ran the child's tiny arms, clung to him tightly as they moved through the broken streets, his legs moving faster than they ever had before. The evacuation ship was still there, still waiting above the smoke-filled sky. But it was so far away it felt like an impossible distance. He had to make it there, he had to. The Sharon soldiers shouted as they saw him break cover. But it was too late. Marcus was already in motion, moving with a speed fueled by desperation, and the need to protect the small life in his arms. Every step felt like it could be his last. But he pushed on, ignoring the exhaustion, the pain, his heart racing with each passing second. He couldn't afford to slow down, couldn't afford to be caught. The ship was closer now, its outline clearer against the smoke-filled sky. He was almost there. The soldiers were falling behind. As he dashed through a crumbling alley, his breath ragged, his legs burning. But he couldn't stop, not now, he wouldn't stop. The ship's engines roared louder, now louder than any of the sounds of battle around him. And for the first time since the conflict began, Marcus felt a sliver of hope flicker deep inside him. The child's grip tightened, as if sensing the same thing. They were almost there, almost safe. He could make it, they could make it. And as the ship came into full view, Marcus's heart lifted for just a moment. But he knew the danger wasn't over yet, not until they were aboard, not until they were out of the reach of the soldiers hunting them. Marcus pushed forward, his legs burning with every step. But he refused to slow down. The evacuation ship was only a few hundred meters away, the roar of its engines filling the air. But the soldiers were gaining on him. He could hear their weapons charging behind him, their heavy footsteps echoing through the ruined streets. Marcus's breath came in ragged gasps, but he kept his focus on the ship ahead. He had no choice but to make it there, no matter what it took. The child in his arms whimpered, and Marcus instinctively tightened his grip, the small body trembling against him, its eyes wide with fear. As they neared the open street, a hail of gunfire erupted behind him, bullets streaking through the air and punching into the rubble around him. But none of them hit their mark. His pulse raced, his ears deafened by the sound of the explosions and weapons fire. But Marcus's feet didn't falter, his eyes locked on the ship that hovered above the ground, its massive doors slowly opening, as if inviting him to safety. The child's soft sobs were the only sound that reached his ears as he ran faster, his chest heaving with the strain, his armor clanking with each stride. He rounded another corner, and the ship came fully into view. The soldiers were no longer in sight. They were behind him for now, but he knew they wouldn't stop. They would hunt him down until they had him and the child. But the ship was close enough now he could almost taste the relief in the air. All he had to do was reach it, get inside, and they would be safe. But just as he thought they had a chance, a new sound ripped through the chaos, the whine of an energy weapon charging directly ahead of him. Before he could react, a blast of plasma exploded into the street, narrowly missing him, but forcing him to stumble and fall to the ground. He scrambled back to his feet, his body screaming in pain, but he didn't have time to stop. The child in his arms clutched tighter, its tiny face buried against his chest as they continued to move forward. Another blast exploded just ahead of them, a wall of energy that lit up the street with a blinding flash. Marcus barely managed to duck in time, his heart in his throat, as the blast tore through the space where they had just been. The air around him sizzled with heat, but he refused to stop. He couldn't stop. The ship was now so close he could see the faces of the soldiers boarding it, their silhouettes framed in the doorways. He could hear their voices shouting to each other to prepare for takeoff, to make sure everyone was aboard. But Marcus knew they weren't going to wait much longer. The enemy was closing and the ship wouldn't stay grounded forever. With a burst of strength, he ran harder, his legs moving with a desperation that pushed him past the pain, past the exhaustion. His heart pounded with every step, the ground shaking beneath his feet as the blasts of energy tore into the earth around him. The child was still pressed tightly against his chest, its tiny arms shaking as they neared the ship's open doors. The final stretch was in front of him, only a few feet away. The last line of defense was the ground crew. They were preparing to leave. The soldiers were climbing into the ship, but Marcus didn't care about them anymore. All that mattered was getting to safety and getting the child on board before it was too late. He made one last push, his body propelled forward with everything he had left. His vision narrowed only on the ship, his ears filled with the deafening roar of the engines and the chaos behind him. But none of it mattered. As he reached the open doors of the ship, the crew saw him and made way, their hands grabbing at the child and pulling them into the ship. But before Marcus could climb aboard, before he could make his escape, a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks and turned his head. The officer from before stood at the edge of the ramp, looking straight at him, her eyes filled with an unreadable emotion. Marcus's breath caught in his throat, his entire body frozen for a moment as the officer's gaze locked with his, her expression unreadable, her eyes dark and intense in the chaos surrounding them. The sounds of battle and gunfire faded for a heartbeat as he stared at her, his heart still racing. But now something else crept into his chest, something he couldn't name, but it made his stomach twist. She should be dead, or at least hunting him down with the rest of her forces. But instead, she stood there watching him, her stance unwavering even as the ground shook with the explosions from behind her. The child in his arms stirred again, a small whimper escaping its lips, and Marcus's mind snapped back into focus. The officer was blocking the way. The crew members inside the ship were waiting, their hands stretched toward him, urging him to climb aboard. The door to safety was so close he could almost taste it, but her presence was like a wall he couldn't ignore. "Go," she said, her voice firm and steady as if it was a command and not a plea. But there was something in her eyes, something that softened the edges of her words, something that made Marcus hesitate just for a fraction of a second. He took a step toward her without even realizing it, his muscles tensing, his mind battling between the need to escape and the pull to understand why she was still here, why she hadn't joined the soldiers, why she wasn't trying to kill him right there and then. "You have to leave now," she said, louder this time, her eyes hardening. She wasn't looking at him anymore, but over his shoulder toward the approaching enemy forces, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. But she didn't move to stop him. She wasn't trying to pull them back or force him to stay. No, she was giving him a chance to escape, and he knew it. Marcus could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him, the child in his arms pressing against him. But there was no time to think. Not with the Sharon soldiers closing in. He turned his head briefly to glance at the ship. Just a few more steps, and they would be on board. They would be safe. But then he turned his gaze back to the officer and saw the quiet resolve in her eyes, the sacrifice he was willing to make for them, for the child. "The ship is leaving without you," he said, his voice low but filled with urgency. "You have to come with me. We don't have time. They'll kill you if you stay." The officer didn't reply, not immediately. She just stared at him for a long moment, her expression softening just a fraction. But then her lips parted, and the words came out quietly. "If I go with you, they'll follow us. The ship will never make it off the ground." She glanced over her shoulder once more at the Sharon forces advancing, their weapons raised, their faces grim and determined. Marcus didn't want to believe it, but he knew she was right. If she left with them, the soldiers would see it as a betrayal. They would hunt them down until every last one of them was dead, and the ship would never survive the assault. It would be just like the last time, and the next time they would all be caught in the open. Her words echoed in his mind, and for a moment he felt paralyzed, caught between the desire to save her and the need to protect the child in his arms. But the decision was made for him when the first shot rang out from the Sharon. Ranks the blast of energy searing through the air toward the ship, and the crew. Marcus didn't think twice. He grabbed the child tighter and turned to face the open door of the ship. The crew pulled him in with urgency and fear in their eyes. The officer remained standing at the bottom of the ramp. She didn't move to follow him, didn't even flinch as the blast of energy exploded into the ground beside her, the shockwave sending dust and debris flying. But still she stood there unwavering, her face set with the determination of someone who had already made their peace. Marcus's heart ached as the ramp began to close behind him, and he looked out at the officer one last time, her figure silhouetted against the chaos. The image burned into his mind as the doors sealed shut, and the ship began to lift off into the sky. He didn't know if he would ever see her again, but he couldn't change the course of what had to be done. The hum of the ship's engines filled the air as it ascended into the smoke-filled sky. But Marcus couldn't focus on the rising altitude. The child in his arms shifted slightly, its small head resting against his chest as the crew around him moved in hurried motions, preparing for takeoff and making sure everyone was secured. Yet Marcus's mind remained on the officer, her face etched in his memory as the ship soared higher, leaving the planet's wreckage behind him. He couldn't stop thinking about her standing there in the rubble, refusing to leave them behind, even though she knew what it meant, even though she knew the consequences. Her sacrifice had been made before he even had the chance to plead with her to come with them. He should have done something, he should have tried harder, but the truth was there hadn't been time to think. Everything had been a blur, and now it was too late. The door to the city was closed behind them, and the officer was still down there with the soldiers who would undoubtedly hunt her down and execute her for what she'd done for helping them escape. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the child in his arms, its soft breathing, the only thing keeping him grounded. But it wasn't enough. He could still see the officer in his mind, standing tall, defiant against the approaching fire of her own people. He couldn't shake the image of her as the ship gained altitude, her expression still unwavering, her eyes filled with something he hadn't expected from an enemy, something far beyond the cold indifference of battle. It was something human. He glanced down at the child in his arms, the small face still calm, but the fear was there. He could feel it radiating from its tiny form like an unspoken question. Why had they been spared? And what would come of the officer's actions? Who would answer for her now? The ship moved steadily through the upper atmosphere, its trajectory set toward a safe zone far from the wreckage of the war-torn planet. But Marcus couldn't focus on the safety of the mission. Not now, not when his mind kept returning to the officer. He wasn't sure if she had known what she was doing when she made the decision to stay behind. If she truly known, it was a one-way choice. But something in her eyes had told him that she did. She had been prepared to sacrifice herself for the sake of the child. The ship's comm system crackled to life, a voice coming through the static announcing their approach to the safe zone. But Marcus barely heard it. His thoughts were consumed with the officer and the lives left behind in the ruins of the city. He glanced around the ship at the other survivors, their faces just as exhausted and hollow as his own. They had been through hell, but there was no relief in sight. The war was still out there, and the enemies they had left behind were still hunting them. He couldn't stop the questions from flooding his mind. What would happen to the officer now? What would happen to her people? How long before they tracked them down again? How many more sacrifices would be needed before it was over? A hand on his shoulder pulled him out of his thoughts. One of the crew members, a woman with dark eyes and a somber expression, looked at him with a quiet understanding. She didn't need to say anything. She just nodded as if to say she understood, but that it was out of their hands now. Marcus nodded back, but it did little to ease the weight in his chest as the ship continued its flight toward the unknown. The child in his arms shifted again, its tiny hands reaching up toward his face, its soft gaze meeting his for just a brief moment. And in that moment, Marcus felt a connection, something that transcended the war, something that reminded him of why he had fought for this life, to protect the innocent, to give them a chance to survive. And if the officer's sacrifice had made that possible, he wouldn't forget it. The stars ahead of them twinkled in the endless expanse of space, but for Marcus all he could see was the memory of the officer standing in the ruins watching them go, knowing that somewhere out there she had given everything for them to escape. And as the ship moved farther from the planet, the realization sank in that the battle wasn't over, it had only just begun.